Werewolf Story, written by Judy. Prologue. What happens when the woman branded worthless becomes the one creature worth protecting? For Irene Hall, being the rejected bride meant a life shattered in front of hundreds of witnesses. At her own wedding altar, she wasn't just left standing alone. She was publicly humiliated, labeled an omega of a woman, and cast into a winter storm by the man who promised to love her. She was nothing. She was discarded. She found shelter in a frozen barn, expecting to die of shame and cold. But when she woke up, she wasn't alone. She was encircled by 7 massive pure white wolves. And they weren't just sleeping, they were standing guard, as if she were their queen. The cold didn't care about vows. It tore through the silk of Irene's wedding dress like claws through paper. Each gust of wind a reminder of the words that still echoed in her skull. I will not wed this omega of a woman. Jacob Lowe's voice had boomed through the church with such finality, such disgust, that even the organ had gone silent. The guests hadn't gasped, they had stared. And that silence, that suffocating, judgmental silence, had been worse than any scream. Irene Hall had been the picture of bridal perfection just hours ago. Hair pinned with winter roses, a dress that cost more than her parents earned in a year, and hope, foolish hope, that today would be the beginning of her life. Instead, it became the end of everything she thought she was. She didn't remember leaving the church. She only remembered running, the train of her dress catching on fence posts, tearing on barbed wire, until she was stumbling through knee-deep snow in nothing but shredded lace and a corset that wouldn't let her breathe. Her fingers were numb, her feet were worse. And behind her, faint but unmistakable, she heard the murmur of voices. Eva Anderson's voice, sharp and cold. Let her go, she's an embarrassment to the family. The barn appeared like a mirage, sagging and dark against the white expanse. Irene pushed through the door and collapsed into the straw, her body finally giving out. The cold pressed in from all sides, seeping into her bones. She curled into herself, shaking violently, and closed her eyes. Maybe this was mercy. Maybe freezing to death was better than facing the morning. Then she heard it. A low, rumbling growl from just outside the barn door. Her breath caught. Her eyes snapped open. And through the gaps in the wood she saw them, shadows, massive and prowling, circling the barn like predators who had found their prey. The first one stepped inside, its breath visible in the frigid air, and Irene's heart stopped. A wolf, pure white, enormous. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixed entirely on her. And behind it, 6 more stepped into the barn, one by one, until she was surrounded. Chapter 1. The Sanctuary of Straw. Irene's first instinct was to scream, but her throat was too raw, her body too broken, and the sound that came out was barely a whimper. She pressed herself against the barn wall, straw digging into her bare shoulders, her torn dress offering no protection, no dignity, nothing. The lead wolf took another step forward. Its paws were the size of dinner plates, silent despite their weight. Its fur seemed to glow in the thin moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the roof. Impossibly clean, impossibly bright. It shouldn't exist. Wolves this size, this color, didn't exist. Not in the real world. But Irene had stopped believing in the real world the moment Jacob Lowe had turned to face the congregation and declared her unworthy in front of God and everyone she had ever known. The wolf's eyes locked onto hers. Not with hunger, not with aggression, with something else. Something that made her skin prickle and her breath hitch for an entirely different reason. It was studying her. The others followed, spreading out in a slow, deliberate formation. One moved to her left, another to her right. 2 positioned themselves near the barn door, effectively blocking her only escape. The remaining 2 settled near her feet, their massive bodies folding into the straw with surprising grace. Irene's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. Tales of rogue wolf packs in the mountains, animals driven mad by hunger, tearing through livestock, and occasionally travelers foolish enough to wander alone. She had always thought those stories were exaggerations. She was wrong. Please, she whispered, though she didn't know what she was begging for. Mercy, a quick end? Her voice cracked on the word, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down her frozen cheeks. Please, just make it quick. The lead wolf tilted its head as if genuinely puzzled by her words. Then, to her utter shock, it lowered itself to the ground. Not in a crouch, not in preparation to pounce. It lay down, fully, its enormous body stretched out along the straw, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from its fur. Heat. Irene's shivering intensified, but not from fear this time. From cold, from the bone-deep, soul-crushing cold that had been eating away at her since she fled the church. The wolf's warmth was impossible to ignore. A beacon in the frozen darkness. Another wolf moved closer, pressing its body against her side. Then another and another. Within moments, she was surrounded by a living wall of fur and muscle and inexplicable, overwhelming warmth. They weren't attacking, they weren't threatening, they were protecting her, warming her, as if she were something precious, something worth saving. Irene's mind couldn't process it. This didn't make sense. Wolves didn't do this. Wild animals didn't form protective nests around broken, discarded women in wedding dresses. This was a hallucination. Hypothermia-induced madness. She was dying, and her brain was offering her a final, cruel fantasy of comfort before the end. But the warmth was real. The steady rise and fall of their breathing was real. The soft, almost rhythmic rumble that vibrated through their chests, a sound somewhere between a purr and a growl, was devastatingly, impossibly real. One of the wolves, smaller than the lead but still massive, rested its head gently on her lap. Its weight was grounding, anchoring her to the moment. Another curled behind her back, supporting her shaking frame. The lead wolf shifted closer, its muzzle just inches from her face, and for the first time since Jacob's rejection, Irene felt something other than despair. She felt seen, not judged, not measured and found wanting, just seen, acknowledged, accepted. Her tears came harder now, but they were different. Not tears of shame or heartbreak, but something deeper, something she didn't have words for. Her body, exhausted beyond measure, began to relax against her will. The warmth seeped into her skin, into her muscles, into the hollow, aching place in her chest where her heart used to be. The wolves shifted subtly, adjusting their positions to cocoon her more completely. The barn, which had felt like a tomb just minutes ago, now felt like a sanctuary. The wind still howled outside, battering the walls, but inside, she was safe, protected, warm. Irene's eyelids grew heavy. She fought it at first, terrified that if she closed her eyes, she would wake up dead. Or worse, wake up back in that church, facing Jacob's sneer and Eva's cold dismissal. But her body betrayed her, pulling her down into the darkness. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was the lead wolf's steady breath against her cheek, and the impossible, undeniable truth that she was not alone. For the first time in her life, something had chosen her. Chapter 2: The Unseen Perimeter. Irene had always believed that silence was the absence of sound. She was wrong. Silence was its own presence, thick and suffocating, and it filled the barn like a living thing the moment she stopped shivering long enough to notice. The storm outside had quieted to an eerie lull, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The wind no longer screamed through the cracks in the walls. The snow had stopped its relentless assault. And in that unnatural stillness, Irene heard something that made every muscle in her body lock tight with primal terror. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling the barn, not human footsteps. The rhythm was wrong, the weight distribution too broad, too powerful. Whatever was out there moved with a predator's confidence. The kind of movement that didn't need to announce itself because it had nothing to fear. Irene's breath came in short, shallow gasps that fogged in the frigid air. She pressed herself harder against the barn wall, as if she could somehow melt into the wood and disappear. The straw beneath her rustled with every tremor that ran through her body, a betraying sound that seemed deafening in the silence. Then came the smell. It hit her like a physical force, wild and earthy and utterly alien. Wet fur, pine, something musky and ancient that her brain couldn't categorize, but her body recognized on an instinctual level. The scent of apex predators, the scent of death. The footsteps stopped. Irene's heart hammered so violently she thought she might vomit. She strained her ears, listening for any indication of where the creature had gone. But there was nothing, just that oppressive, suffocating silence. Then she saw it. A shadow fell across the gap in the barn door, impossibly large, backlit by the pale moonlight reflecting off the snow. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, massive and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Irene bit down on her knuckle to keep from making a sound, tasting blood and salt and fear. Her mind raced through every half-remembered lesson from childhood about what to do if you encountered a wild animal. Make yourself big, make noise, run. No, don't run, play dead, don't make eye contact. None of it mattered. She was trapped. She had nowhere to go, no strength left to fight, nothing to defend herself with except a ruined wedding dress and the rapidly diminishing hope that this was all still just a nightmare. The barn door creaked. It wasn't locked. It had never been locked. The old wood groaned as something pressed against it from the outside, testing its resistance. Irene watched in frozen horror as the door swung open with agonizing slowness, revealing the creature that had been circling her sanctuary. A wolf, but not like any wolf she had ever seen in books or nature documentaries. This animal was enormous, easily the size of a small bear, with a chest so broad it barely fit through the doorway. Its fur was pure, blinding white, so clean and pristine it seemed to glow with its own internal light. But it was the eyes that paralyzed her. They weren't the yellow or amber she expected. They were pale, almost silver, and they held an intelligence that made her skin crawl. The wolf looked at her the way a human might look at a wounded bird, with curiosity and something else she couldn't name. It took one step inside, then another, and as it moved, Irene saw more shadows gathering behind it. 6 more wolves, each as massive and white as the first, filed into the barn with silent, coordinated precision. They moved like a unit, like soldiers who had trained together for years, spreading out to surround her in a perfect circle. Irene's throat closed. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except watch as the wolves positioned themselves around her with terrifying efficiency. 1 blocked the door, 2 flanked her sides. The others filled in the gaps until there was no escape, no hope, nothing but the inevitability of what was about to happen. The lead wolf, the first one that had entered, took another step closer. Close enough now that Irene could see the individual strands of fur moving with each breath, could smell the wild, clean scent of its coat, could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. She closed her eyes and waited for the end. After everything Jacob had done to her, after the humiliation and the rejection and the cruelty, maybe this was fitting. Maybe this was the universe's way of saying she had never deserved to exist in the first place. A soft huff of air brushed against her face. Irene's eyes snapped open. The wolf was staring at her, its silver eyes just inches from her own, and in those eyes she saw something that shattered every assumption she had made. Not hunger, not malice, not even indifference, recognition, as if the wolf knew her, as if it had been looking for her. Chapter 3: The Impossible Claim. The lead wolf lowered its massive head, and for one heart-stopping moment, Irene thought it was going to close its jaws around her throat. She had seen enough nature documentaries to know how predators killed. Quick, efficient. A single bite to sever the vital arteries. She braced herself, every muscle rigid, her mind screaming prayers she had forgotten she knew. But the bite never came. Instead, the wolf pressed its muzzle gently against her shoulder, the touch so careful, so impossibly tender, that Irene's mind blanked. The animal's breath was warm against her frozen skin, its fur softer than anything she had ever felt. It held the contact for several seconds, as if offering comfort, then slowly pulled back. And then it did something that defied every law of nature Irene understood. It lay down beside her, not in a crouch, not coiled to spring. The wolf stretched its enormous body along the length of hers, close enough that its fur brushed against her torn dress, and settled its weight into the straw with a soft exhale. The warmth that radiated from its body hit Irene like a wave, so sudden and overwhelming that she gasped. She had been cold for so long, bone-deep and soul-crushing cold, that she had forgotten what warmth felt like. But this was more than warmth. This was life itself, pouring into her frozen limbs, chasing away the numbness that had been slowly killing her. The other wolves moved as one. 2 positioned themselves on either side of her, their massive bodies pressing against her with gentle, deliberate pressure. Another curled behind her back, its bulk supporting her trembling frame. One rested its head across her lap, the weight grounding and strangely comforting. The remaining 2 settled at her feet and near her head, completing the circle. Within seconds, Irene was encased in a living cocoon of fur and muscle and impossible, merciful warmth. Her mind couldn't process it. This wasn't how wolves behaved. Wild animals didn't seek out humans to protect them. They didn't form protective nests around strangers. They didn't look at broken women with eyes that seemed to say, "We've got you now, you're safe." But her body didn't care about logic. Her body only knew that for the first time since Jacob's voice had shattered her world, she wasn't alone. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't worthless. She was chosen. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ugly and completely beyond her control. The wolves didn't flinch. They didn't pull away. If anything, they pressed closer, their warmth intensifying, their steady breathing creating a rhythm that her own lungs began to match without conscious thought. The lead wolf shifted slightly, adjusting its position so that its body curled more fully around her. Another wolf, one with a distinctive silver marking above its eye, rested its chin on her shoulder, its breath warm against her neck. The combined heat of 7 massive animals surrounded her like a furnace, driving out the cold that had been eating her alive. Irene's tears flowed freely now, soaking into the white fur pressed against her cheek. She had cried in the church when Jacob rejected her. She had cried as she ran through the snow. She had cried when she collapsed in this barn, certain she would die alone and unmourned. But these tears were different. These tears carried something she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Relief, acceptance, the overwhelming, terrifying sensation of being wanted. Her eyelids grew heavy. She fought against it, some part of her brain still insisting this couldn't be real, that she would wake up dead or worse. But the warmth was relentless, seeping into every frozen corner of her body, every shattered piece of her heart. The wolf's breathing created a hypnotic rhythm, steady and sure, like a lullaby sung in a language older than words. One of the wolves made a soft sound, almost a purr, that vibrated through its chest and into her body. Another responded with a gentle rumble. The sounds wrapped around her, a conversation she couldn't understand, but somehow felt included in. Irene's resistance crumbled. Her body, pushed beyond every limit it had, surrendered to the warmth and the safety and the impossible gift of these creatures' protection. Her breathing slowed, her muscles relaxed. The pain in her chest, the shame that had been crushing her since the moment Jacob spoke those awful words, began to recede. The last conscious thought she had before sleep dragged her under was that she had spent her entire life trying to be worthy of love, trying to earn her place in a world that saw her as less than. And in the end, it hadn't mattered, because these wolves hadn't asked her to prove anything. They hadn't demanded explanations or justifications. They had simply looked at her, broken and discarded and barely alive, and decided she was worth saving. As darkness claimed her, Irene felt something she had never experienced before. Peace. Chapter 4. The Nest of White. Consciousness returned to Irene slowly, like surfacing from deep water. For a blissful moment, she existed in that liminal space between sleep and waking, aware only of warmth and safety and the absence of pain. Her body felt heavy, relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months, maybe years. The constant tension she carried in her shoulders, the knot of anxiety that lived permanently in her chest, had dissolved. Then memory crashed back in. The wedding, Jacob's voice, the cruel word Omega spat like a curse in front of everyone she had ever known, Eva Anderson's cold dismissal, the freezing run through the snow, the barn, the wolves. Irene's eyes snapped open, her heart immediately racing, expecting to find herself torn apart, finally claimed by the predators that had surrounded her in the night. But the pain never came. The violence never materialized. Instead, she found herself staring at something so impossible, so achingly beautiful that her breath caught in her throat. 7 massive white wolves lay sleeping around her in a perfect circle. The early morning light filtered through the gaps in the barn's roof, painting everything in shades of gold and silver. The beams caught the wolves' fur, making them glow like creatures from a fairy tale, ethereal and otherworldly. They were even more magnificent in daylight than they had been in shadow. Each one was unique, subtle differences in size, in the set of their ears, in the patterns of their breathing. The lead wolf, the one that had entered first, lay stretched along her right side, its massive head resting on its paws just inches from her hip. Even in sleep, it maintained a protective posture, its body angled so that it formed a barrier between her and the barn door. Another wolf was curled behind her back, its warmth pressed against her spine. A third had its head resting on her thigh, the weight oddly comforting. They were all asleep, deeply, peacefully asleep, as if they had spent the entire night standing guard and had only now allowed themselves to rest. Irene didn't move. She barely dared to breathe. Her mind struggled to reconcile what her eyes were seeing with everything she knew about the natural world. Wolves didn't do this. They didn't adopt humans. They didn't form protective nests around strangers and keep them warm through the night. And yet here she was, alive and warm and surrounded by proof that everything she thought she knew was wrong. One of the wolves, a slightly smaller one with a distinctive patch of silver behind its ear, stirred in its sleep. Its paw twitched, and it made a soft whuffing sound, almost like a dog dreaming. The mundane, familiar gesture in such a surreal situation made something crack open inside Irene's chest. These creatures had saved her life, not because they had to, not because she had earned it or deserved it or proved herself worthy. They had saved her simply because she needed saving. They had looked at her, broken and rejected and dying in the snow, and decided she mattered. The thought was too much, too big, too overwhelming. Tears welled in Irene's eyes, but they were different from the tears she had shed in the church or during her desperate flight. These tears came from somewhere deeper, from a place in her soul that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. They were tears of recognition, of finally being seen not as something lacking or deficient, but as something precious. A sob escaped before she could stop it, and immediately the lead wolf's eyes opened. Irene froze, suddenly terrified that any movement, any sound, would break whatever spell had kept her safe through the night. The wolf's pale silver eyes focused on her face with that same unsettling intelligence she had seen the night before. It studied her for a long moment, its gaze moving from her tear-streaked face to the trembling hands she had pressed against her mouth. Then deliberately, the wolf lifted its massive head and rested it on her lap. The gesture was so gentle, so clearly intentional, that Irene's remaining composure shattered completely. Her hands moved of their own accord, trembling fingers sinking into the thick, impossibly soft fur. The wolf's eyes closed, a rumbling sound of contentment vibrating through its chest. Permission. It was giving her permission to touch, to take comfort, to accept what was being offered. Irene's fingers tightened in the wolf's fur, and she bent forward, her forehead resting against the animal's broad skull. The sobs came harder now, years of rejection and shame and self-loathing pouring out in great heaving waves. She cried for the girl who had spent her entire life trying to be good enough. She cried for the woman who had believed Jacob Lowe when he told her she was worthless. She cried for every moment she had accepted cruelty as her due, had shrunk herself down to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold her. And through it all, the wolves stayed. The lead wolf remained perfectly still beneath her touch, its warmth steady and grounding. The others began to wake one by one, their eyes opening to regard her with that same calm acceptance. None of them moved away. None of them seemed disturbed by her breakdown. They simply bore witness, their presence a silent promise that she was no longer alone. Time lost meaning. Irene had no idea how long she stayed there, folded over the lead wolf, her tears soaking into white fur that smelled of pine and snow and wild, clean freedom. It could have been minutes or hours. All she knew was that when she finally lifted her head, when her tears finally slowed to hiccuping gasps, something fundamental inside her had shifted. The shame that had lived in her chest since Jacob's rejection, the crushing weight of worthlessness that Eva Anderson's dismissal had cemented, had been replaced by something else. Something fragile and new, but undeniably real. Worth. Not earned or proven or justified, just inherent, essential worth. The wolves had seen it in her when no one else had. They had known it instinctively, had responded to something in her that she hadn't even known existed. And their certainty, their absolute conviction that she deserved protection and warmth and care, was beginning to reshape how she saw herself. Irene looked around at the circle of massive, beautiful creatures surrounding her. Each one was awake now, their silver eyes fixed on her with varying expressions of what she could only describe as contentment. They looked pleased, satisfied, as if they had accomplished exactly what they set out to do. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and cold. "I don't understand why you did this, but thank you." The lead wolf's tail moved in a slow, deliberate wag. Another wolf, the one that had been sleeping at her feet, stretched and moved closer, pressing its shoulder against her side. The message was clear. They weren't done protecting her yet. For the first time since Jacob Lowe's voice had shattered her world, Irene allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. Maybe the ending she had accepted in the church, the ending where she died alone and unmourned in the snow, wasn't the only possibility. Maybe there was another path, one guarded by 7 white wolves who had decided she was worth defending. The morning light grew stronger, golden beams illuminating the barn's interior and catching on motes of dust that danced in the air. Outside, she could hear the distant drip of melting snow, the first signs that the storm had passed. The world was waking up, and for the first time in her life, Irene was waking up with it. Not as something broken or rejected, but as something chosen. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know how long this impossible sanctuary would last, or what it meant that these creatures had claimed her. But as she sat in the center of her nest of white, surrounded by warmth and acceptance, and silent, fierce protection, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer the woman who had fled that church. That version of Irene Hall, the one who had believed Jacob's words and Eva's contempt, had died in the snow. Whatever she was now, whoever she was becoming, would be something entirely new. Chapter 5. The ranger's stunned gaze, the sound of boots crunching through snow made all 7 wolves' heads snap up in perfect unison. Irene's heart, which had just begun to settle into something resembling calm, immediately kicked back into panicked overdrive. The wolves rose as one, their movements fluid and coordinated, repositioning themselves around her with military precision. The lead wolf moved to stand directly in front of her, its massive body blocking her from view of the barn door. 2 others flanked her sides. The remaining 4 formed a secondary perimeter, their bodies tense and ready. She had seen them peaceful and protective. Now she was seeing them as what they truly were, apex predators preparing to defend their claim. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft jingle of equipment and the rustle of heavy outdoor gear. A human. Someone was approaching the barn. Irene's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had Jacob sent someone to find her? Had Eva convinced the family to track her down and finish what the storm had started? Was this someone from town who would drag her back to face more humiliation? A low, rumbling growl emanated from the lead wolf's chest, a sound so deep and threatening that Irene felt it in her bones. The other wolves took up the warning, their combined voices creating a wall of sound that made the barn's old wood vibrate. "Easy now," a man's voice called from outside, calm and measured despite the obvious threat. "I'm not here to hurt anyone, just following tracks." The voice was unfamiliar, with a slight roughness that suggested years of outdoor work and weather. Not Jacob, not anyone from the wedding. Irene wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. The barn door, which had been left ajar since the wolves' arrival, was pushed slowly open. A figure appeared in the entrance, backlit by the morning sun, and Irene's breath caught. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in forest ranger gear that had clearly seen hard use. Dark hair shot through with gray, a weathered face that spoke of someone who spent more time with trees than people, and eyes that were currently very, very wide with shock. Thomas Castillo, though Irene didn't know his name yet, had been tracking this particular wolf pack for 3 years. He had dedicated countless hours to studying their patterns, their territory, their unprecedented behavior. He had seen them take down elk, had watched them navigate the wilderness with an intelligence that defied conventional understanding. He thought he had seen everything these magnificent creatures were capable of. He had been catastrophically wrong. The ranger stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still on the doorframe, staring at a scene that his brain simply refused to process. 7 white wolves, the exact pack he had been tracking, were arranged in a perfect defensive formation around a woman in what appeared to be a destroyed wedding dress. The wolves weren't attacking her, they were guarding her, protecting her from him. And the woman herself, pale, tear-streaked, with dark hair tangled with straw and eyes that held the kind of devastation Thomas had only seen in trauma survivors, was staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between terror and desperate hope. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, his professional composure shattering completely. The lead wolf's growl intensified, and Thomas instinctively raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. His rifle was slung across his back. his sidearm holstered and untouched. He had learned years ago that approaching this pack with any hint of aggression was suicide. "I'm not going to hurt her," he said, keeping his voice steady and low, addressing the wolves directly. "I can see she's under your protection. I respect that." The wolves didn't relax, but the growling quieted to a watchful silence. Thomas had studied animal behavior his entire adult life. But what he was seeing now transcended anything in the textbooks. The pack's body language, their formation, the way they oriented themselves around the woman, it was the same protective behavior they showed toward their own pack members, toward family, but this woman wasn't a wolf. She was human, and she was clearly in trouble. Thomas's eyes cataloged the details with trained efficiency. The wedding dress, expensive but torn to shreds. The woman's bare feet, blue-tinged and showing signs of frostbite. The way she was shaking, though whether from cold or fear or shock, he couldn't tell. The complete absence of any supplies, any coat, anything that would suggest she had planned to be out here. This woman hadn't come to the wilderness by choice. She had fled here, and given the state of that dress, she had fled from a wedding. "Ma'am," Thomas said gently, shifting his gaze from the wolves to the woman. "My name is Thomas Castillo. I'm a wildlife ranger with the State Forest Service. I'm not here to take you anywhere you don't want to go, but you're hurt and you're going to lose those toes to frostbite if we don't get you warm and treated soon." Irene stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. A ranger, not Jacob, not Eva, just a man who tracked wolves and had stumbled onto something he clearly hadn't expected. "They saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Last night, I was going to freeze and her voice broke. They kept me warm." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. He had devoted his career to understanding these wolves, to protecting them from poachers and developers, and people who saw them as nothing more than dangerous animals to be eliminated. He had argued in countless meetings that this pack was special, that they displayed behavior that suggested a level of intelligence and purpose beyond typical wolf packs. And here was his proof. Living, breathing proof that these wolves understood something fundamental about protection and worth that most humans had forgotten. "I believe you," he said, and meant it completely. "I've been studying this pack for years. They don't do anything without reason." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The fact that they chose to protect you, that means something important." Irene's eyes filled with fresh tears, but Thomas could see the shift in her expression. The terror was receding, replaced by cautious hope. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. "I have a cabin about 2 miles from here. It's warm, it's safe, and I have medical supplies. The wolves can come too if they want. I won't separate you from them." It was an insane offer. Inviting 7 massive wild wolves to follow them to his cabin violated every protocol in the Ranger Handbook. But Thomas had stopped following the handbook the moment he realized this pack was something unprecedented. And this woman, whoever she was, whatever had driven her into the wilderness in a wedding dress during a blizzard, had been chosen by them. That made her his responsibility too. Chapter 6: The First Step of Trust. The lead wolf turned its massive head to look at Irene, and in that moment, Thomas witnessed something he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to skeptical colleagues. The wolf and the woman held eye contact, and something passed between them. Not communication in any conventional sense, but understanding. A silent question asked and answered. The wolf's tail moved in a slow, deliberate wag, then it stepped aside. Permission granted. Irene tried to stand and immediately gasped in pain. Her legs, which had been curled beneath her for hours, screamed in protest. Her feet, damaged by frostbite and the brutal run through the snow, refused to support her weight. She collapsed back into the straw with a choked cry. Thomas moved without thinking, instinct overriding protocol. He crossed the barn in 3 long strides, already shrugging out of his heavy winter coat. The wolves tensed, but didn't attack. The lead wolf watched him with those unsettling silver eyes, assessing, judging, deciding. "Easy," Thomas murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the wolves or the woman or himself. "I'm just going to help. I promise I'm going to help." He knelt beside Irene, careful to move slowly, telegraphing every motion. Up close, she looked even worse than he had initially thought. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her hands showed signs of severe cold damage. The wedding dress, which must have been beautiful once, was nothing but shredded silk and lace barely holding together. My name is Irene, she said suddenly, her voice stronger than he expected. Irene Hall. Irene, Thomas repeated, offering a small, genuine smile. It's good to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. He held out his coat. This is going to be too big, but it's warm and it's dry. Let me help you put it on. Irene stared at the offered coat, and Thomas saw her face crumple. It was such a simple gesture, such a basic act of kindness, but she looked at it like he was offering her the world. You don't even know me, she whispered. You don't know what I did, why I'm here. Don't need to, Thomas interrupted gently. You're hurt. You need help. That's all I need to know. He paused, his expression softening. And for what it's worth, anyone who earns the protection of this pack is someone worth protecting. They don't make mistakes about things like this. He helped her into the coat, his movements careful and professional. The garment swallowed her small frame, but the warmth was immediate. Irene's shaking intensified for a moment as her body registered the temperature change, then gradually began to settle. I can't walk, she admitted, shame coloring her voice. My feet, I can carry you, Thomas said simply. If you'll let me. Irene's eyes widened. The wolves will come with us or they won't. That's their choice. Thomas glanced at the lead wolf, which was still watching him with that intense, measuring gaze. But I'm guessing they're not done protecting you yet. He was right when Thomas carefully lifted Irene into his arms, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing. All 7 wolves immediately moved to surround them. They formed a protective convoy, the lead wolf taking point, 2 on each flank, and 2 bringing up the rear. It was a formation Thomas had only seen them use when moving vulnerable pack members through dangerous territory. This is insane, Irene breathed, her head resting against Thomas's shoulder. This can't be real. Been tracking wildlife for 20 years, Thomas said, his voice warm with something that might have been wonder. And I've never seen anything like this. So yeah, it's insane, but it's also real. The walk to the cabin should have been treacherous. 2 miles through snow-covered wilderness, carrying an injured woman, accompanied by 7 massive wolves. But the pack moved with such coordinated efficiency that they carved a path through the snow, taking turns breaking trail so Thomas could walk on relatively solid ground. Irene watched them work, her mind still struggling to accept what was happening. These creatures had saved her life. They were still saving her life. And this stranger, this ranger, who had no reason to help her, was carrying her to safety without asking for explanations or justifications. Why are you doing this? She finally asked, her voice muffled against his coat. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his breath fogging in the cold air. I told you you need help. But you don't know anything about me, about what happened. I know you were running from a wedding, Thomas said quietly. I know someone hurt you badly enough that you'd rather risk death in a blizzard than face them again. I know you're brave enough to survive a night that should have killed you. And I know 7 of the most intelligent, perceptive creatures I've ever studied decided you were worth protecting. He looked down at her, his expression serious but kind. That's enough for me. Irene felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed shut since Jacob's cruel words in the church. Thomas wasn't asking her to prove her worth. He wasn't demanding she earn his help or justify her existence. He was simply offering sanctuary, the same way the wolves had, without conditions or expectations. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Everyone deserves basic human kindness, Irene, and you deserve a hell of a lot more than that. Thomas's arms tightened slightly, his voice fierce. I don't know who made you believe otherwise, but they were wrong. The cabin appeared through the trees, a sturdy structure built for function rather than beauty. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting Thomas had a fire going before he left to track the pack. The wolves didn't hesitate, following Thomas right up to the porch as if they had done this 100 times before. Thomas pushed the door open with his shoulder and carried Irene inside, settling her carefully on a worn but comfortable couch positioned near the fireplace. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical force, and she couldn't suppress a gasp of relief. The wolves filed in behind them, shaking snow from their fur, and settled around the room with the same protective formation they had used in the barn. The lead wolf positioned itself directly beside the couch, its head level with Irene's hand. Thomas watched the entire scene with an expression of amazed disbelief. I need to call this in, he said, more to himself than to Irene. This is going to rewrite everything we know about wolf behavior. Then he caught himself and looked at Irene with sudden concern. Unless you don't want me to. If you're running from someone, if you need to stay hidden, I don't care anymore, Irene said, surprising herself with the truth of it. Let them know, let everyone know. I'm done hiding. I'm done being ashamed of myself. Thomas smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. Good, because shame is about the last thing you should be feeling right now. He moved to a cabinet and began pulling out medical supplies, his movements efficient and sure. Let's get you warmed up properly, treat that frostbite, and get some food in you. Then if you want to talk about what happened, I'll listen. And if you don't, that's fine too. You're safe here, Irene. For as long as you need. Irene looked around the cabin, at the crackling fire, at the 7 massive wolves who had chosen her, at the kind stranger who asked for nothing but offered everything. And for the first time since Jacob Lowe's voice had shattered her world, she allowed herself to believe what Thomas was saying. She was safe. She was protected. She was impossibly, finally home. Chapter 7. Shedding the Shroud. Thomas returned from the bedroom carrying a pile of clothes, thermal underwear, wool socks, a flannel shirt that would hang to Irene's knees, and sweatpants with a drawstring waist. He set them carefully on the arm of the couch, his eyes pointedly averted from the ruined wedding dress. Bathroom's through there, he said, gesturing to a door on the right. There's a shower if you want it. Though we should probably treat your feet first. The hot water might be too painful right now. Irene looked down at the dress, at the torn silk and crushed lace that had cost more than her parents earned in 6 months. It had been custom-made, fitted to her exact measurements, designed to make her look like the perfect bride. Eva Anderson had supervised every detail, making subtle comments about how certain cuts might minimize Irene's unfortunate proportions, or how the veil should be arranged to distract from her plain features. She had felt beautiful in it once, for approximately 45 minutes, between when the seamstress declared it perfect and when Jacob Lowe had looked at her walking down the aisle and decided she wasn't worth having. Now it was just fabric. Expensive, ruined fabric that represented everything she never wanted to be again. I need to get this off, Irene said suddenly, her fingers trembling as they found the remnants of the zipper. I need it off, now. The lead wolf lifted its head, sensing her distress. Thomas moved closer but stopped short of touching her, his hands raised in a calming gesture. Okay, that's okay, let me help. I can do it, Irene said, her voice sharper than she intended, then softer. I need to do it myself. Thomas nodded and stepped back, understanding without needing explanation. This wasn't about the dress. This was about reclaiming something, about taking back control of her own body after having every choice stripped away. Irene's fingers found purchase on the torn zipper. The mechanism had been damaged during her flight. The delicate slider bent beyond repair, but with enough force, the fabric gave way. She pulled the dress over her head, not caring about the ripping sounds or the way the beating scattered across Thomas's floor like broken teeth. Underneath, she wore only the corseted bodice and thin undergarments, both soaked through with melted snow and sweat. She should have felt exposed. She should have felt vulnerable. Instead, she felt free. I was supposed to marry him yesterday, she said, her voice hollow. Jacob Lowe. We'd been engaged for 8 months, I thought. Her voice cracked. I thought he loved me. Thomas didn't interrupt. He simply sat down in the chair across from her, his posture open and patient, and waited for her to continue. The ceremony was perfect. Eva Anderson, Jacob's aunt, she planned everything. She said it was her gift to us, but really it was her chance to parade the family's wealth in front of the entire town. Irene clutched the flannel shirt Thomas had given her, holding it against her chest like a shield. I walked down that aisle thinking it was the beginning of my life. And then I reached the altar, and Jacob looked at me like I was something that had crawled out from under a rock. One of the wolves moved closer, pressing its warm body against her legs. Irene's free hand automatically moved to sink into its fur, drawing comfort from the solid, steady presence. He waited until the priest asked if anyone objected. Can you imagine? A bitter laugh escaped her throat. He objected to his own wedding. He told everyone, and I mean everyone. The church was packed. that he wouldn't marry this omega of a woman. That's what he called me, an omega. Like I was less than human, less than worthy of basic dignity. Jesus, Thomas breathed, his expression darkening. That's not just rejection, that's public humiliation, that's cruelty. Eva agreed with him. Irene's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I heard her when I was leaving. She told someone to let me go, that I was an embarrassment to the family. My own parents just stood there. They didn't defend me. They didn't follow me. They just let me run out into a blizzard like I was garbage they were happy to be rid of. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Irene had carried them alone through the snow, through the barn, through the impossible night with the wolves. But saying them out loud to another person made them real in a way they hadn't been before. Real and devastating and finally outside of her own head. They were wrong, Thomas said, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. Every single one of them was wrong. Irene looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. How can you know that? You don't know me. Maybe Jacob was right. Maybe I am. Stop. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. I've spent 20 years studying behavior, animal and human. I know cruelty when I see it. What that man did to you wasn't about your worth. It was about his lack of it. People who are secure in themselves don't need to destroy others publicly. They don't need an audience for their rejection. He gestured to the wolves surrounding them. And these creatures? They don't protect weakness, Irene. They're apex predators. They respond to strength, to something essential and true. The fact that they chose you, that they risked their own safety to keep you alive, tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. Irene wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. But Jacob's words were still echoing in her skull, Eva's contempt still burning under her skin. I spent my whole life trying to be good enough, she whispered. I was the perfect daughter. I never complained. I worked 2 jobs to help pay for the wedding. I changed everything about myself to fit what Jacob wanted, my hair, my clothes, even the way I spoke. And it still wasn't enough. I still wasn't enough. Because you were trying to be someone else, Thomas said gently. And the only person you can ever be enough for is yourself. The simple truth of it hit Irene like a physical blow. She had spent so long contorting herself into shapes that pleased other people that she had no idea who she actually was underneath all the performance. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. I don't know how to just be myself when I don't even know who that is anymore. Thomas smiled, sad but understanding. That's okay. You've got time to figure it out. And you've got 7 very determined bodyguards who seem to think you're worth the effort. Irene looked around at the wolves, at their patient, watchful presence. They hadn't asked her to be anything other than what she was. They hadn't required her to earn their protection or prove her value. They had simply seen her in her most broken, desperate moment and decided she deserved to live. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that could be a starting point. She pulled the flannel shirt on over her head, letting the soft fabric fall around her like armor. It smelled like wood smoke and pine and safety. She worked on the sweatpants next, struggling with her damaged feet, until Thomas quietly offered assistance and she accepted. When she was finally dressed in clothes that belonged to no one's expectations but her own, Irene felt something shift. The wedding dress lay in a heap on the floor, a white silken corpse of the woman she used to be, the woman who believed Jacob Lowe's assessment of her worth, the woman who accepted Eva Anderson's cruelty as deserved. That woman was gone. And whoever Irene was becoming, she would be someone who had been chosen by wolves and offered sanctuary by a stranger who asked for nothing in return. Thank you, she said quietly, meeting Thomas's eyes, for listening, for not telling me I'm being dramatic or that I should just get over it. You survived something that would have broken most people, Thomas said. The last thing you're being is dramatic. He stood, moving toward the kitchen. Now let's get some food in you and treat those feet properly. Healing takes time, but it starts with the basics. As he bustled around the small kitchen, the lead wolf rested its massive head on Irene's lap, its silver eyes holding hers with that same calm certainty. And for the first time since she could remember, Irene allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't defined by someone else's rejection. A future where she was simply, finally, enough. Chapter 8. A Purpose Found. 3 days passed in Thomas's cabin, and Irene felt herself slowly returning to a body and mind she barely recognized. The physical healing was straightforward. Thomas treated her frostbite with professional efficiency, wrapped her damaged feet, fed her warm food that actually tasted like something other than obligation. But the other healing, the kind that happened in the spaces between words, in the quiet moments watching the wolves, was something altogether different. The pack had never left. They rotated between the cabin and the surrounding woods, but at least 3 wolves remained inside at all times, their presence a constant grounding reminder that she had been chosen. The lead wolf, whom Irene had started calling Silver in her mind because of his distinctive pale eyes, rarely left her side. On the morning of the 4th day, Irene woke to find Thomas sitting by the window with his coffee, watching the wolves with an expression of wonder that hadn't faded since he'd found her. "I've been tracking them for 3 years," he said without preamble, as if continuing a conversation they'd been having. "I've documented behaviors that shouldn't be possible, coordinated hunting strategies that suggest planning and foresight, problem-solving that requires abstract thinking, but this," he gestured to where Silver lay beside the couch, his massive body curved protectively around Irene's sleeping form. "This is something else entirely." Irene sat up carefully, her feet still tender but healing. "What do you think it means?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from wolf to wolf. "In my professional opinion, I think we're looking at a species that's evolved beyond what we understand as typical wolf behavior. There are legends, of course, stories from indigenous peoples about wolves that chose humans, that formed bonds deeper than training or domestication." He looked at her, his expression serious. "But those were always dismissed as mythology." "And now?" Irene asked, her hand moving automatically to rest on Silver's head. "Now I think mythology might just be science we haven't figured out how to measure yet." Thomas took a sip of his coffee. "The question isn't what they are, Irene. The question is why you?" It was the question Irene had been asking herself for days. Why had 7 massive predators decided she was worth saving? What had they seen in her that she couldn't see in herself? As if sensing her thoughts, Silver lifted his head and held her gaze. Those silver eyes, ancient and knowing, seemed to look straight through her skin and bone to something deeper, something essential. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like waking from a long sleep, Irene understood. "They didn't choose me because of who I was," she said slowly, the realization unfolding as she spoke. "They chose me because of who I could become." Thomas set down his coffee, his full attention on her now. "Jacob was wrong about me. Eva was wrong, but I was wrong too." Irene's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I thought my worth came from being acceptable to them, from fitting into their idea of what I should be. But these wolves," she looked around at the pack, at their patient, unwavering presence. "They don't care about any of that. They saw something in me that had nothing to do with whether I was good enough for Jacob Lowe or whether Eva Anderson approved of me." "What did they see?" Thomas asked quietly. Irene was silent for a moment, her fingers tightening in Silver's fur. "Strength I didn't know I had. The kind of strength that survives a night that should have killed me. The kind that keeps breathing even when everything inside is screaming to give up." Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of shame or pain. They were tears of recognition. "They saw someone worth protecting, not because I earned it, just because I exist." Silver made a soft sound, almost like agreement, and pressed his muzzle against her hand. The other wolves in the cabin moved closer, forming their familiar protective circle, and Irene felt something fundamental click into place inside her chest. She had spent her entire life measuring her worth by external validation, by her parents' approval, by Jacob's affection, by Eva's impossible standards. She had genuinely believed that without those things, she was nothing. But the wolves had shattered that belief. They had looked at her absolute lowest, broken, abandoned, dying in the snow, and decided she was everything, not because of what she could do for them or how well she performed or whether she met some arbitrary standard, simply because she was. "I'm not going back," Irene said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. "Not to Jacob, not to my parents, not to anyone who made me believe I was less than I am." "Good," Thomas said simply, "because you deserve better than people who treat you like you're disposable." "I don't know what comes next," Irene admitted. "I don't have a job, I don't have money, I don't even have identification. Everything was in my car at the church." She looked at Thomas. "But I know I can't go back to being that woman who accepted cruelty as her due." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You could stay here, temporarily," he added quickly. "Just until you figure out what you want to do. I could use help with my research on the pack and—" "Yes," Irene interrupted, surprising herself with the speed of her answer. "Yes, I want to stay. I want to understand them. I want to understand this." She gestured to the wolves, to the impossible bond that had formed. "And I want to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to please people who don't deserve it." A slow smile spread across Thomas's weathered face. "Then welcome to the team, Irene Hall." Silver stood, his massive body unfolding with fluid grace, and placed both front paws on the couch so he was eye level with Irene. She met his gaze without fear, without the need to look away or make herself smaller. And in those ancient silver eyes, she saw her own reflection transformed. Not an omega, not a reject, not someone to be ashamed of. A woman chosen by wolves. A woman strong enough to survive the unsurvivable. A woman who was finally beginning to recognize her own worth. Irene wrapped her arms around Silver's neck, pressing her face into his fur, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." The wolf's rumbling response vibrated through her chest, a sound of contentment and certainty and something that felt remarkably like pride. And Irene understood, with a bone-deep knowing that would sustain her through whatever came next, that she had found her pack. Not the one she was born into, not the one that rejected her, but the one that had chosen her in her darkest hour and shown her that worth wasn't something to be earned. It was something to be recognized. And she was finally ready to see it. Chapter 9. Thomas's Shield. The phone rang on the afternoon of the 5th day, shattering the peaceful quiet of the cabin. Thomas was outside chopping wood, and Irene was sitting by the fire with 3 of the wolves, reading from Thomas's collection of wildlife journals. The sudden electronic trill made all 3 wolves' heads snap up, their bodies tensing. Irene's heart clenched. Something about that ring felt wrong. Thomas came through the door, brushing snow from his shoulders, and moved to answer the ancient landline mounted on the kitchen wall. "Castillo," he answered, his voice carrying the professional tone he used when speaking to the Forestry Service. But his expression changed almost immediately. His eyes found Irene's across the room, concern flashing across his features. "No, I haven't seen anyone matching that description," he said carefully. "When did she go missing?" Irene's blood turned to ice. She knew even before Thomas said another word who was calling. "I understand your concern, Mr. Lowe, but this is a vast wilderness area. If your fiancé ran out into that blizzard 5 days ago..." Thomas paused, listening, his jaw tightening. "I see. Well, if I come across anyone, I'll certainly notify the appropriate authorities." The emphasis on appropriate authorities was deliberate. Thomas's eyes never left Irene's face as he continued, "No, I'm sorry, but I can't allow civilian search parties in this area. It's dangerous terrain, and we've had reports of unusual wolf activity. For your own safety, I'd recommend staying clear of the northern sectors." Another pause. Thomas's expression darkened. "That's quite a reward, Mr. Lowe. Though I have to ask, if you cared enough to offer $50,000 for her return, why did you reject her at the altar in front of hundreds of witnesses?" Irene could hear Jacob's voice through the receiver, raised and angry, though she couldn't make out the words. Thomas's face remained impassive. "I see. Well, as I said, if I come across Ms. Hall, I'll contact the proper authorities. Have a good day, Mr. Lowe." He hung up without waiting for a response. The silence that followed was deafening. Silver, who had been resting by the fire, stood and moved to position himself between Irene and the door. The other wolves followed suit, their protective instincts activated by the threat they couldn't see but somehow sensed. "He's looking for you," Thomas said unnecessarily. "He's convinced you're still alive, lost somewhere in the wilderness. He's offering a reward for information leading to your rescue." Irene's hands trembled. "What did he say? At the end?" Thomas hesitated, clearly weighing whether to tell her. Then he sighed. "He said you were confused and mentally unstable, that the wedding was called off because you had a breakdown, and you ran before anyone could help you. He made it sound like he's the concerned fiancé trying to save his beloved from herself." A bitter laugh escaped Irene's throat. "Of course he did. Can't let the truth ruin his reputation. She looked at Thomas, fear creeping into her voice. What if he comes here? What if he finds me? Then he deals with me, Thomas said flatly. And before he gets to me, he deals with them. He nodded toward the wolves, who had arranged themselves in a defensive formation that would make any military strategist proud. Something tells me they won't take kindly to anyone who threatens you. As if to emphasize the point, Silver let out a low, rumbling growl that made the windows rattle. Irene stood, her healing feet supporting her weight more easily now. She moved to the window and looked out at the snow-covered wilderness. Somewhere out there, Jacob was spinning his narrative, making himself the hero and her the victim who needed saving. Eva was probably helping him, crafting the perfect story to protect the family name. 5 days ago, the thought of facing them again would have sent her spiraling into panic. 5 days ago, she would have believed their version of events, would have accepted that she was broken and confused and in need of rescue. But 5 days ago, she hadn't been chosen by wolves. She hadn't met Thomas Castillo, who offered protection without demanding anything in return. She hadn't spent days rebuilding herself from the inside out, recognizing her worth not as something granted by others, but as something intrinsic and unshakable. Let him come, Irene said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Let him waste his money and his time searching. He won't find the woman he threw away. Thomas moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. What will he find? Irene met her own reflection in the window glass. The woman staring back was different from the bride who had run into the snow. Stronger, fiercer, unbroken, despite everything that should have shattered her. Someone he never deserved in the first place, she answered. Thomas's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, the touch respectful and grounding. For what it's worth, I think you're right. And I think… He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think you're going to be just fine, Irene Hall. Better than fine. Silver moved to press against Irene's other side, his massive body a warm, solid promise. The other wolves gathered close, forming their protective circle, and Irene felt something she had never experienced before. Complete certainty in her own worth, complete trust in the beings around her, complete freedom from the need to prove herself to people who would never see her clearly. He can't hurt me anymore, she said, and it was true. Not because Jacob couldn't cause problems, he certainly could, but because his opinion of her, his rejection, his cruelty, no longer had the power to define her reality. She had been rebuilt by wolves and a ranger who saw strength where others saw weakness. She had been forged into something new in the frozen barn. In the warmth of this cabin, in the steady presence of creatures who asked nothing but gave everything. What do you want to do? Thomas asked. We could make it official, file a report, get you declared safe, or we could… Wait, Irene interrupted. Not yet. I'm not ready to deal with the outside world, with the questions and the judgment and people trying to force me back into a box I don't fit in anymore. She looked up at Thomas. Is that okay? Can I just stay here a little longer and figure out who I am before I have to explain it to everyone else? As long as you need, Thomas promised. You're not a prisoner here, Irene. And you're not a burden. He smiled, something warm and genuine. You're pack now, both theirs and mine. The words settled around Irene like a blanket. Pack, family, chosen, not born. Earned through survival and trust and the simple act of being seen. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere in the distance, Jacob Lowe was searching for a woman who no longer existed. And here, in a ranger's cabin surrounded by 7 white wolves who had decided she was worth protecting, Irene Hall was finally home. The phone rang again. Thomas glanced at Irene, a question in his eyes. She shook her head. Don't answer it. Whatever he has to say, I don't need to hear it. Thomas nodded and let it ring. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the cabin returned to peaceful silence. Silver made a contented sound and settled back down by the fire. The other wolves relaxed their defensive postures, though they remained alert. And Irene, for the first time in her life, felt exactly where she was supposed to be, not defined by someone else's rejection, not diminished by cruelty or contempt, just herself, whole and worthy, surrounded by the family she had found in the last place she ever expected. The wolves had chosen her, Thomas had protected her, and she had finally chosen herself. That was worth more than any wedding, any approval, any validation the world could offer. That was everything. Thank you so much for joining Irene on her journey here at Judy's Romance Library. If this story of wolves, redemption, and discovering your own worth touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we bring you a brand new dark paranormal romance every single day. Drop a comment and tell me, do you think Jacob will find Irene? And what do you think will happen when he does? Are you Team Thomas? And what do you believe those 7 white wolves really are? Remember, you are never defined by those who reject you. Your worth is inherent, unshakable, and recognized by those who truly see you. Stay wild, stay strong, and I'll see you tomorrow with another tale of magic, mystery, and the kind of love that changes everything. Until then, may you always find your pack. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.